Before we begin, find yourself somewhere comfortable. Let your shoulders soften, your breathing slow. This is a story told at the pace of starlight, meant for quiet hours, when the world outside grows dim and the mind is ready to wander without effort. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to remember. If your thoughts drift, that's perfectly fine. The story will keep going patiently, whether you're listening closely or only half aware of the sound. Tonight we begin with snow. Not the kind that feels magical or fleeting, not the kind that arrives softly and vanishes by morning, but snow that falls where memory says it doesn't belong. Snow piling up on roads that were never meant to carry it. Snow pressing down on power lines, on trees, on places that have no instinct for how to respond. And if you were watching the news during those days, the story likely sounded familiar. Inches measured, roads closed, flights cancelled, wind speeds announced with urgency, palm trees bending under a white sky, filmed from a distance and replayed again and again. But that was never really the story. That was only the surface of it, only the part that shows up on screens. What was happening beneath all of that, beneath the snowfall and the headlines and the scrolling numbers, was something quieter and far more unsettling. Because when snow begins to fall in places that haven't seen it in generations, it isn't just weather making an appearance. It's a pattern stepping out of alignment. It's the atmosphere behaving in a way that doesn't match its own long memory. And long memory is something the atmosphere has. For centuries it has moved according to rhythms so reliable that entire societies have learned to build their lives around them. Winters arrive, winters leave. Some are colder, some are gentler, but they tend to follow a script that feels familiar enough to trust. Roads are built with certain assumptions. Power grids are designed with certain limits. Cities quietly assume that some things simply won't happen here, until one winter they do. At first it doesn't feel dramatic, just an inconvenience, just a strange cold morning, just snow sticking to the ground longer than expected. But there is a moment, subtle and easy to miss, when people begin to sense that this isn't behaving like the storms they remember, that the cold doesn't move on schedule, that the wind doesn't relax, that the system itself seems stuck, as if something behind the scenes has failed to reset. That feeling is important. It's the moment this story truly begins. Because what unfolded wasn't a single storm, no matter how intense it looked on radar. It was the visible expression of a deeper imbalance, one that had been building quietly far above the clouds, long before the first snowflake reached the ground. The atmosphere is layered, like a slow-moving ocean stacked on top of itself. And while we live at the very bottom of it, where weather touches skin and pavement, the decisions are often made much higher up, in places we never see, in regions where air moves on longer timescales, where disruptions don't pass quickly, and where recovery is supposed to be almost automatic. Supposed to be. This winter, something didn't recover. A storm intensified faster than expected, feeding on contrasts that had grown too sharp, too extreme. Cold air plunged south while warm ocean water waited beneath it, and the collision released energy with surprising force. Meteorologists have names for this kind of thing, careful terms they don't use lightly. But names don't capture what it feels like when familiar places wake up buried under conditions they were never designed to handle. What matters more than the name is the timing, because this storm did not arrive alone. It arrived during a moment when the atmosphere was already unsettled, already stretched thin, already behaving as if the usual safeguards were offline. The kind of moment where small pushes can lead to large outcomes, where coincidence starts to feel less convincing, not because everything is connected in a simple way, but because stress has a way of revealing weaknesses that were always there. This is where curiosity becomes more useful than fear. Because the question isn't whether storms will happen, they always have. The question is whether the systems that guide them are still operating within the boundaries we've come to expect, whether the rhythms we've trusted are still keeping time, or whether they've begun to drift. You don't need to answer that tonight. You don't need to hold on to the question at all. Just notice how easily we assume recovery, how instinctively we believe that after disruption comes balance, that after chaos comes reset. It's comforting to think of the atmosphere as self-correcting, endlessly resilient, always finding its way back to familiar ground. And often it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the pattern breaks quietly without announcement. The snow melts eventually, the roads reopen, The news cycle moves on, and yet, high above, the machinery that governs winter may still be out of alignment, still struggling to reorganize itself, still allowing cold and wind and instability to wander farther than they should. This chapter isn't about disaster, it's about recognition, about realizing that what we felt on the ground was only the echo of something much larger unfolding above us, a signal that the atmosphere was operating under unusual rules at an unusual moment, with consequences that hadn't fully revealed themselves yet. And as we drift forward, gently, without urgency, we'll begin to rise into those higher layers, into the quiet places where winter is shaped long before it ever reaches the surface. Where recovery is expected but not guaranteed. For now, let the snow fall softly in your mind. Let the storm pass without effort. There's no need to stay fully awake for what comes next, because the real story is waiting higher up, where the air itself forgot how to heal. The snow you imagined a moment ago, resting quietly on roads and rooftops, did not choose where to fall. It was guided there. Above the clouds, above the flight paths and weather maps, there is another layer of winter, one most people never think about. A place where air moves slowly, deliberately, where changes take weeks instead of hours, and where the seasons are not felt as cold or warmth, but as structure and balance. This is where winter usually keeps its discipline. This is where cold is meant to stay contained, circling patiently around the top of the world, held in place by a broad, invisible current that turns endlessly from west to east. Most winters that current holds. It bends now and then, shivers under pressure, but it recovers. The system remembers itself. Cold air drifts south for a short visit, reminds us of its reach, and then retreats again, drawn back toward the pole like water finding its basin. The rhythm is old and familiar, so reliable that few ever question it. This winter that rhythm faltered. High above the ground, in the stratosphere, something loosened. Not suddenly, not with a single dramatic moment, but gradually like stone worn smooth by water over time. The circulation that usually locks the cold in place began to stretch, then weaken, then slip out of alignment. Winds that should have flowed steadily lost their direction. The structure that keeps winter orderly began to unravel, and unlike most disruptions, it did not snap back. Days passed, then weeks. The system did not recover on schedule. Cold air that should have remained distant spilled outward, not in one clean surge, but continuously, feeding the surface with a steady supply of instability. Each wave of cold made the contrast sharper, the gradient steeper, the atmosphere more restless. Storms had more to work with. Energy lingered where it usually disperses. The machine kept turning, but without its usual restraint. This is where patience becomes part of the story, because the stratosphere does not respond to urgency. It does not hurry because we want answers, and it does not correct itself simply because we expect it to. It operates on its own time, like deep water adjusting after a stone has been dropped. The ripples travel slowly, but they travel far. As the weeks stretched on, the lower atmosphere began to respond. The jet stream, usually smooth and directional, started to wander. It dipped and arched, pulling Arctic air farther south than memory suggested it should go, while allowing warmer air to press northward in other places. The boundaries blurred, the flow lost its discipline, and where those opposing forces met, storms found room to grow. None of this happened loudly. There was no announcement. From the ground, it simply felt like winter refusing to let go, like cold that overstayed its welcome, like storms that arrived with more intensity than expected, then lingered, then made room for the next. The sensation of being caught inside something that wasn't moving forward or backward, just holding its shape longer than it should. This persistence matters more than any single event, because when the upper and lower layers of the atmosphere begin to speak to each other too clearly, when disruption above reinforces disruption below, the system can lock itself into a pattern. Not permanently. Nothing in the atmosphere is permanent, but long enough to reshape weeks, sometimes months, of lived experience on the ground. It becomes less about weather and more about endurance. Cold settles into places not prepared for it. Infrastructure strains quietly. People adjust their routines, then adjust them again. And all the while, far overhead, the containment that should have eased begins to feel fragile, as if the atmosphere itself is hesitating, unsure of how to return to what it once considered normal. There is no drama in this hesitation. Only wait. It's the feeling of waiting for something to mend and realizing it hasn't yet begun. The awareness that the system is still processing the disruption, still absorbing the energy that was pushed into it, still carrying the memory of imbalance forward. And memories in the atmosphere linger longer than we think. As this chapter draws to a close, there is no resolution to offer. The cold has not finished moving. The winds above have not reorganized themselves. The structure that should have healed remains distorted, stretched thin across the top of the world. What that means becomes clearer when we look back down at what this persistence does to the places built on the assumption that winter behaves itself. For now, let the thought drift gently, like snow settling in slow motion. There's no need to follow every detail. The atmosphere is still deciding how this winter will unfold. What the atmosphere does far above us eventually makes itself known on the ground, not all at once, and not always dramatically, but through small failures that accumulate quietly. Roads that were never meant to hold ice begin to shine under headlights. Power lines sag a little lower than usual. Pipes stiffen in the dark, water slowing inside them as if hesitating. None of this feels extraordinary at first. It feels like inconvenience. It feels temporary. And that assumption, more than anything else, is what this chapter is about. Because infrastructure is not just concrete and steel. It is memory made physical. It is a record of what a place believes its future will look like, based on what its past has delivered. Every city carries these assumptions invisibly, written into how many snowplows it owns, how much salt it stores, how thick its insulation is, how its power grid is balanced between resilience and efficiency. These choices are not careless. They are reasonable responses to long histories of weather that behaved itself, until it doesn't. 12 inches of snow is not in itself a remarkable number. In many places it is barely worth comment, brushed aside with routine and experience. But numbers do not exist in isolation. They only make sense in context, and context is everything when snow falls in a place that has no memory of it, no cultural instinct for how to move through it, no systems designed to absorb its weight. This is where the quiet damage begins. Cars slide where they were never meant to slide. Intersections freeze into stillness. Supply lines pause, not because they are fragile, but because they were never meant to operate under these conditions. Power flickers, then disappears, not dramatically, but one neighborhood at a time, one transformer at a time, each failure small enough to seem manageable until they overlap. The atmosphere does not consider preparedness. It only delivers what the pattern allows, and when the pattern remains stuck, when cold keeps returning without relief, the margin for error disappears. Repairs take longer. Crews grow tired. Materials that were meant to flex begin to crack. The system enters a state it was never designed to occupy for more than a moment. This is where water becomes stone. Pipes freeze, expand, and split, not with a loud break, but with a slow, internal pressure that goes unnoticed until the thaw arrives and the damage reveals itself. Heating systems labour continuously, pushed beyond their familiar rhythms. Generators hum in the darkness, sometimes where they shouldn't, sometimes longer than they safely can. None of this shows up in weather maps. None of it fits neatly into forecasts. It exists in living rooms and kitchens and quiet hours spent waiting. In places where winter usually passes gently, people are not trained to expect prolonged cold. They don't own the clothing, the tools, the habits that make endurance feel routine. And so the cold presses closer, not as an abstract condition, but as a presence that enters daily life, rearranging sleep, meals, movement, and patience. This is not panic. It is adaptation under stress. And stress reveals the limits of assumptions faster than anything else. Airports slow and then stop, not because flight is impossible, but because coordination breaks down when ice becomes unfamiliar. Hospitals stretch resources. Emergency responders navigate roads that behave like glass. Each system holds as long as it can, leaning on redundancy, on training, on experience, until those buffers thin. The atmosphere above remains indifferent. It does not adjust because infrastructure is struggling. It does not ease because the ground is unprepared. The cold keeps coming because the containment above has not reasserted itself, because the higher layers are still unsettled. still feeding instability downward. This is what makes the situation feel heavier than a single storm. The events are not isolated, they're clustered. One follows another closely enough that recovery never quite completes. The system is always almost caught up, always just behind the present moment, and in that gap, small failures become consequential. It is tempting to think of this as bad luck, as an unfortunate alignment of circumstances that will soon pass. And maybe it will. The atmosphere always changes eventually. But even temporary misalignment can leave lasting marks when it pushes systems beyond their intended use. Infrastructure adapts slowly. Weather can change quickly. That difference in pace matters. Cities cannot redesign themselves between storms. Power grids cannot be rebuilt in the space between cold fronts. People cannot learn new instincts overnight. And so, the strain accumulates quietly. One decision at a time, one night without heat, one road left untreated because there aren't enough crews to reach it yet. This is not failure in the dramatic sense. It is mismatch. A world built for one rhythm being asked to move to another. As this chapter settles, there is no judgment to assign, no single cause to point to, only the recognition that when patterns shift faster than preparation can follow, the ground feels it first, and what happens on the ground, in turn, tells us something about what is still unresolved above. The cold has not finished speaking, the systems are still listening. And somewhere far beyond the clouds, forces much larger than roads or power lines continue their slow conversation, setting the conditions for what comes next. While the ground struggles to adapt, while cities wait for systems to recover and routines to return, something else is unfolding far beyond the reach of clouds and storms. It happens so far away that it feels almost abstract, a distant motion with no urgency attached to it, and yet it moves with a patience that mirrors the atmosphere itself. 93 million miles from the snow-covered roads and darkened neighbourhoods, the surface of the sun is never still. It churns slowly, a vast ocean of fire and magnetism, folding and twisting upon itself in rhythms far older than weather, far older than memory. Most of the time, this activity goes unnoticed, its influence softened by distance, its variations absorbed quietly by the layers of space that surround our planet. But sometimes, the timing matters. On the face of the sun, regions of concentrated magnetic tension appear like dark islands against a bright sea. They grow gradually, shaped by forces beneath the surface, turning and tightening as the sun rotates. These regions do not announce themselves, they simply exist, storing energy the way a stone stores heat after a long day in sunlight. And then occasionally, that energy is released. Not explosively in the way we imagine explosions, but suddenly, through a rearranging of invisible lines of force. Light and radiation surge outward, particles accelerate, space itself responds. And though the sun is unimaginably distant, these changes do not remain confined to its surface. They travel, carried on streams of charged particles that move endlessly outward, filling the space between star and planet. Most of the time, Earth receives this flow without incident. Our magnetic field bends it gently aside, guiding it around us, protecting the atmosphere below from direct harm. The interaction produces little more than faint adjustments, subtle shifts that rarely demand attention. But when the sun is particularly active, when a region has grown complex and unstable, the flow becomes stronger, more structured, more capable of pressing against the boundaries that usually hold firm. This is where patience becomes essential, because the sun does not operate on human schedules. It does not align its activity with our expectations or our crises. It rotates steadily, carrying active regions across its face, bringing them into positions where their influence matters more, then carrying them away again. There is a window, brief on cosmic scales, where geometry aligns and any release of energy is aimed more directly toward Earth. A window measured not in urgency but in hours. During this time, forecasters watch quietly, not with alarm but with attention, because what matters is not certainty but probability, the likelihood that stored energy will be released, the chance that if it is, the resulting disturbance will travel along paths that intersect with our planet's magnetic shield. Nothing is guaranteed, nothing is forced, and yet the atmosphere below remains in a fragile state, still unsettled from disruptions that have not resolved themselves. The containment that usually brings winter back into balance is still weakened. The jet stream still wanders. The surface remains sensitive to even small changes in the forces acting upon it. This is why timing matters more than intensity. A powerful event arriving during stability can pass with little consequence. A subtle influence arriving during imbalance can echo more loudly than expected. The system's response depends less on the strength of the push and more on the condition of what is being pushed. The Sun continues its slow rotation. Active regions drift closer to alignment, then closer still, their magnetic structures tightening as they move. Energy accumulates quietly without sound or spectacle, waiting for a moment when the balance tips. When it does, light reaches Earth in minutes. Particles arrive days later, and in between, the space surrounding our planet adjusts, currents shifting, fields responding, layers of the upper atmosphere warming and expanding ever so slightly. These changes do not announce themselves to those on the ground. They do not shake buildings or darken skies. They ripple through regions we never see, altering density, pressure, and motion at heights far above the clouds. Alone, they are insignificant. But arriving during a time when the atmosphere is already strained, already sensitive, they become part of the larger conversation. Not a cause, a contribution. The ground does not feel the sun directly, but it lives beneath layers that do. And those layers, when disturbed, communicate slowly downward, like waves travelling through deep water, reshaping currents long after the initial motion has passed. There is no drama in this process, only patience. The window opens, the window closes. Whether anything passes through it is a matter of chance, timing, and the quiet rules of physics that govern systems far too large to hurry. And regardless of the outcome, the atmosphere continues its work, absorbing influences, responding in its own time, carrying the consequences forward into days and weeks yet to come. As this chapter settles, there is nothing to fear and nothing to anticipate. Only the understanding that Earth does not exist in isolation, that the snow on the ground, the strain on infrastructure, and the instability above are all part of a larger system, one that includes the slow turning of a star and the invisible space between. If your thoughts drift here, let them. The sun will keep rotating, the atmosphere will keep listening. And in the quiet that follows, we turn toward the question of how such distant influences might whisper into the storms below, through a mechanism few ever pause to consider. There is a tendency, when systems become complicated, to draw firm borders between them, to say that weather belongs to one domain and space belongs to another, that what happens above the clouds is separate from what happens beyond the atmosphere, and that each can be understood cleanly on its own. These boundaries are comforting. They make the world feel organized, predictable, easier to explain. But nature is rarely impressed by our boundaries. Between the surface of the Earth and the emptiness of space lies a region that does not fit neatly into either category. It is neither weather in the familiar sense, nor vacuum in the cosmic one. It is a layered, restless place, where air becomes thin, where particles carry electric charge, where sunlight does more than warm. This region is quiet, and yet it is always active, responding to influences from above and below at the same time. This is where the mechanism lives. It does not announce itself. It does not behave dramatically. It works slowly, subtly, like water seeping through stone, altering structure not through force, but through persistence. And because its effects are indirect, because it does not produce immediate, obvious results, it is often overlooked. When energy from the sun reaches Earth, most of it passes by harmlessly, guided around the planet by magnetic fields that have been holding this quiet vigil for billions of years. But some of that energy finds pathways inward, flowing along invisible lines toward the polar regions, where Earth's magnetic shield opens just enough to let the interaction occur. High above the weather, the upper atmosphere responds. Particles accelerate, currents flow. The air warms slightly, not enough to be felt, not enough to matter on its own, but enough to change density, enough to cause expansion. And when layers of the atmosphere expand unevenly, they do what fluids always do when disturbed. They move, they ripple, they send waves outward. These are not waves you can see. They travel through air that is too thin to carry sound, through layers we never experience directly. They move both upward and downward, carrying tiny amounts of energy and momentum with them, descending slowly toward regions where weather takes shape. By the time they arrive, they are faint, almost indistinguishable from the background motion of the atmosphere itself. Almost. Under stable conditions, these waves pass through unnoticed, absorbed without consequence. The atmosphere is resilient when it is balanced. It has room to accommodate small disturbances, to smooth them out, to return to its prior state without effort. But balance is not what we have been living with. The containment above is already weakened. The flow that normally guides winter is distorted. Temperature contrasts are sharper than usual, and the jet stream has lost its steady rhythm. The atmosphere in this state is not calm water. It is water already moving, already sloshing against its boundaries, and in such conditions even a small nudge can matter. The mechanism does not create storms. It does not summon snow or wind or cold out of nothing. It simply alters timing, shifts probabilities, changes which paths become easier to follow. It is the difference between a system hovering just below a threshold and one that crosses it. A whisper, not a command. This is why the connection is so difficult to prove and so easy to dismiss. There is no single event you can point to and say, this did that. The atmosphere is too complex for that kind of clarity. Instead, patterns emerge slowly, across many instances, across long spans of time. Subtle correlations, slight tendencies, storms that deepen a little more often than expected following certain conditions. Nothing dramatic, nothing definitive, and yet enough to make careful observers pause. This is the space where science becomes patient, where certainty gives way to curiosity, where the absence of simple answers is not a failure, but an invitation to look more closely. The mechanism remains incomplete, not because it is imaginary, but because it operates in a realm that resists isolation, woven into systems that influence one another constantly. The sun does not cause winter, space does not control weather, but they are not strangers to each other either. They are parts of a continuous system, exchanging energy across layers, across scales, across distances that feel vast only because we are accustomed to thinking in straight lines rather than networks. What happens far above the clouds can shape the environment in which storms develop, just as what happens at the surface can influence the layers above. This winter has made those connections harder to ignore. With the atmosphere already unsettled, already struggling to return to its familiar structure, the usual buffers are thinner. The system is listening more closely than it normally would. Sensitive to timing, responsive to influences that might otherwise fade into the background. There is no need to assign blame here, no need to reach for conclusions. The mechanism is not a warning. It is a reminder that Earth systems are layered, intertwined, patient, that causes and effects do not always line up neatly in time or space, that understanding sometimes arrives long after events have passed, when enough quiet evidence has accumulated to be seen. As you rest with this idea, let it remain gentle. You do not need to hold every detail. You do not need to stay awake to follow every thread. The atmosphere will continue its slow work whether we understand it fully or not, absorbing influences, redistributing energy, searching for balance. And somewhere between the surface and the sun, the mechanism continues, unnoticed, unhurried, shaping outcomes not through force, but through timing. In the next quiet stretch of this story, we turn toward what happens when that balance does not return as expected, when recovery itself becomes delayed, and winter lingers longer than memory says it should. Winter is meant to move, it is meant to arrive, settle briefly, and then loosen its grip as light slowly returns to the higher latitudes. Even in its harshest years, there is usually a sense of progression, a feeling that the season is following a path laid down long before any of us were here. The cold comes, it tests the system, and then it eases, allowing balance to reassert itself. This time the easing never quite arrived. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere remained suspended in a state that felt unfinished. The containment above stayed distorted. The winds that should have reorganized themselves continued to hesitate. Cold air lingered where it was never meant to linger, not as a single dramatic surge, but as a steady presence that refused to retreat. Recovery, when it comes, is usually quiet. The upper atmosphere slowly rebuilds its structure. Circulation strengthens, boundaries sharpen, the deep cold withdraws toward the pole, and the lower layers respond in turn, smoothing out the turbulence that had been fed from above. It is a process that requires patience, but it almost always happens on a familiar timeline. Almost. This winter stretched beyond that expectation. The stratosphere did not snap back into place. The pattern did not resolve itself cleanly. Instead, the system hovered in between states, neither fully disrupted nor fully restored, carrying the memory of imbalance forward day after day. And memory, in a system like this, matters. Because the atmosphere does not forget instantly. It holds on to prior conditions, allowing them to influence what comes next. A delayed recovery alters probabilities, making certain outcomes more likely, others less so. Storm tracks repeat. Cold air finds familiar paths. Each event reinforces the pattern that allowed it to exist in the first place. It becomes circular, self-sustaining, quietly persistent. On the ground, this persistence feels like waiting without resolution. Communities begin to ask when things will return to normal, not realizing that normal itself is defined by the recovery they are waiting for. Infrastructure continues to operate under strain. People adapt their routines again and again, adjusting expectations downward, learning to live within a season that feels longer than it should. There is no single moment where it becomes clear that recovery has failed. There is only the accumulation of days. This is where darkness becomes part of the story, not as something frightening, but as something instructive. Darkness slows perception, it blurs edges, it invites stillness. And in that stillness, it becomes easier to notice patterns that urgency usually hides. The pattern here is not one of collapse, but of delay. The system is still capable of restoring balance. Nothing has broken permanently. But the time it takes matters, because while the atmosphere works on its own schedule, the world beneath it continues to live, to build, to assume. The longer recovery is postponed, the more those assumptions are tested. Stone does not crack all at once. Water does not carve canyons in a day. Change happens through repetition. A winter that refuses to release its hold teaches this lesson quietly. It reminds us that stability is not a constant, but a process that must be maintained. That systems we rely on are resilient, but not infinitely so. That patience is not just a personal virtue, but a requirement when living inside something larger than ourselves. There is a temptation, at the end of such a story, to search for conclusions, to ask whether this winter was an anomaly, or a signal, or a warning. But the atmosphere rarely answers in words. It answers in tendencies, in shifts that only become clear after enough time has passed to see them properly. For now, there is only observation. The cold will eventually retreat. The upper winds will reorganize themselves. The long rhythm will resume because it always does. But the memory of this delay will remain, etched subtly into data, into experience, into the quiet understanding that recovery is not guaranteed to arrive on the schedule we expect. As this final chapter settles, there is nothing to resolve and nothing to fear. Only the invitation to rest inside the uncertainty without tension. To allow the story to end not with certainty but with awareness. If you have drifted, that is good. If you're still listening, that is good too. The atmosphere continues its slow work above us, patient as stone, fluid as water, carrying winter forward until it is ready, truly ready to let it go. As the story fades here, nothing more needs to happen. The atmosphere will keep moving quietly, far above where we live. Cold will loosen its hold when it's ready. Winds will find their paths again, and the systems that seemed unsettled will, in time, remember their balance. There is no final answer required tonight, no lesson to carry forward with effort. Only the understanding that the world is patient, layered, and deeply interconnected in ways that unfold slowly, whether we are watching or not. If the questions linger, they can rest for now. If the images drift, let them drift. Snow melts, darkness softens, stone holds warmth longer than we expect. You've done enough simply by listening. Let your breathing slow again. Let the edges of the day dissolve. The sky above continues its quiet work, and the ground beneath you is steady and still. Nothing more is asked of you. Good night.